In 1887, Michelson and Morley carried out an experiment to check this speed of the Earth through the ether. They passed light through two long arms, one in the direction of the Earth's travel and the other at right angles to it. The light traveling in the direction of the Earth's travel should have taken longer to return than that traveling at right angles to the Earth's direction of travel. To the amazement of the scientific world, no such speed as 30 kilometers per second was detected. But they did get speeds between 1 and 10 kilometers per second. Ignoring these speeds, this experiment is always referred to as giving a null result. This shook the scientific world, and to overcome the implication that the Earth was stationary, they invented the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. This claimed that the arm that was in the direction of the Earth's travel became shorter, so that the time to return was the same as in the other arm. There was absolutely no justification for such a solution. It was only invented to overcome the idea that the Earth was stationary in the ether. As Arthur Miller stated, this invention of the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction was a physics of desperation. So troubling was this to scientists that eventually Einstein produced his relativity theory, by which he overcame the problem by simply abolishing the ether. He first said that he did not know of the Michelson-Morley experiment, but later admitted that he produced his theory to overcome the Michelson-Morley result. Einstein's biographer commented, "The problem that now faced science after the Michelson-Morley null result was considerable, for there seemed to be only three alternatives. The first was that the Earth was standing still, which meant scuttling the whole Copernican theory and was unthinkable. The second was that the ether was carried along by the Earth in its passage through space, a possibility which had already been ruled out to the satisfaction of the scientific community by a number of experiments, notably those of the English astronomer James Bradley. The third solution was that the ether simply did not exist, which to many 19th century scientists was equivalent to scrapping current views of light, electricity, and magnetism and starting again." Notice that the last two possibilities are quite different from the first one. The first possibility is rejected not because there was any scientific result that contradicted it. Indeed, it is the only one that fits all the results of the experiments carried out. The other two run into huge experimental problems, requiring much mathematical juggling and sleight-of-hand tricks to come to their defense. The first is rejected because of the purely philosophical horror of having to accept the possibility that the Earth truly is stationary and at the center of the rotating ether. The Earth really is at the center of the universe. It is the geocentric model that actually has by far the best support from the scientific results we have been examining and the simplest explanation of them. The Michelson-Morley experiment is the only one of 4 experiments that is well known. The other 3 experiments never taught are: 1. The Michelson-Gale experiment, that showed that the ether was passing across the surface of the Earth once every 24 hours. 2. Airy's failure experiment proved that it was the moving starlight carried by the rotating ether that was passing across the stationary Earth. 3. The Sagnac experiment that proved there was an ether, thus demolishing relativity theory. Let us examine briefly these 3 experiments. The Michelson-Gale experiment used sealed tubes covering a large area that measured the speed of the ether relative to the surface of the Earth. They obtained a value that was within 2% of the known speed of about 0.45 kilometers per second at the equator. But this speed could have been due either to the Earth spinning in a stationary ether or the passing of the rotating ether around a stationary Earth. It was Airy's failure experiment that proved it was the moving ether passing across a stationary Earth. If the Earth was stationary and the stars were stationary, the starlight would come straight into the telescope. However, if the telescope is moving at, say, 5 miles an hour, you would then have to tip the telescope, let us say, 5 degrees to see the star. However, if the starlight is being carried across the surface of a stationary telescope at 5 miles an hour, you would still have to tip the telescope at 5 degrees to see it. So you cannot tell which one is stationary. To see whether it is the telescope or the stars that are moving, all you have to do is to fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the light when it is in the telescope. If it is the telescope that is moving, then you have to tip the telescope a little further because of the slower speed of the light in the telescope. However, if it is the stars that are moving past the stationary telescope, then the telescope does not have to be tipped any further because the starlight is coming in at the correct angle anyway. That Airy failed to find any further tipping was needed proved that it was the telescope and therefore the Earth that was stationary. This important conclusion was not even mentioned in his report. It was too explosive. Sagnac split a beam of light and sent the two beams in opposite directions around a path, recombined the beams and noted their interference fringes. The whole system was on a turntable, and he then turned it at 2 revolutions per second, remeasured the fringes and found that they had changed. This was due to the movement of the mirrors, made the path for one beam longer and the other shorter. This proved that the ether existed, because once the light left the source, its speed was controlled by the comparatively stationary ether in the laboratory. This demolished Einstein's relativity theory, which had abolished the ether. So, from these 4 experiments, it is obvious that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and the sun, planets, moons, and stars are all being swept around the stationary Earth. This is the only explanation that satisfies the most obvious results of all these 4 experiments. No wonder the universities distort the Michelson-Morley experiment and do not teach the other 3 hidden experiments. So to summarize, the Michelson-Morley experiment showed that the Earth was not going round the sun. The Sagnac experiment showed that the ether did exist, thus demolishing relativity. The Michelson-Gale experiment showed that the ether was passing across the Earth's surface once every 24 hours, and Airy's failure proved it was the Earth that was stationary and the ether was traveling around us.